Welcome to the second episode of the League Express podcast. I'm Jake Kearnan, and joining me again is the editor of League Express, Martyn Sadler. Martyn, how's your weekend been?
It's been great, Jake. Yeah, it's been a really interesting weekend of rugby league, isn't it? I mean, Sunday for us is all bound up with producing this newspaper. So, I always look forward to Monday because it's a bit of a rest from doing that. But no, it's a great sport, great to be involved with, and some fantastic games over the weekend, both here and in Australia, I should say, because I'm quite a keen student of the NRL as well. Some shock results, one or two, and some really interesting news stories to talk about. So, I think we're going to be here for the rest of the day, aren't we, talking about those?
Absolutely. And no shock surprises before going to print this week?
No, fortunately, nothing happened on Sunday night after we went to print as the previous week when Darryl Powell, got sacked at 9 o'clock on Sunday night, which had me cursing. But fortunately, nobody. Andy Last got the push, of course, this weekend. But fortunately, and I'm very grateful to Castleford, they didn't announce it on a Sunday night, so that was great to see.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one
bad
of the...
for Andy, though, sadly, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the news topics we'll get into. Alongside the Warrington Wolves have named Sam Burgess their head coach from 2024 to 2025, I believe.
Yeah,
and we'll also
amazing story, really.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shock, you could say, but it's great to see Sammy Burgess coming back. We'll also get into the Castleford Tigers, a bit of, not controversy, but obviously they've sacked their head coach, and we also saw a bit of a fans' protest in the stadium.
We did, yeah.
Following that one.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that as well. We'll also look towards next week, or this weekend's Challenge Cup final. A lot of news surrounding that. It's highly anticipated. We can't wait to get into it.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll start by quickly taking a look at the weekend that's been, some of the games we saw. Why don't we start with the televised games? So Catalans Dragons 30 defeat Warrington 10.
Well, yeah, Catalans just keep going, don't they? They're 4 points ahead of the rest in Super League. Wigan and Leigh, 4 points behind them, and they always look too strong for Warrington on last Thursday night. And I think the really fascinating thing about the Catalans, Jake, is, and their coach Steve McNamara made reference to it afterwards, is the way that some of their French players are starting to really play well and really be prominent in their team. They do seem to have a stack of young French players rather, coming through their ranks at the Catalans, and they're making a bigger and bigger impression. It's a bit sad that Martha Morg's injured at the moment because he's one of the most prominent of them, but they're just playing it. Benjamin Garcia, the captain, leading by example, I think. And 30 points to 10. It was such a convincing win, and Warrington, are just clinging on to a top six place now, with a lot of teams just behind them, ready to jump in and take their place, unless they start winning again.
That was one of the things you and I were really excited to see, how Warrington bounced back following the departure of Darryl Powell.
Not too well.
Yeah, that's right.
Although Gary Chambers, to be fair to Gary Chambers, the interim coach now, he was quite happy with them. They showed, I think he pointed out, they showed a lot of spirit. They never stopped battling, and they've actually scored a late try, if I remember rightly. But Josh Thulis on 77 minutes. But, Warrington earlier in the season would have given the Catalans a much tighter game, and there is something missing from them, isn't there? And it's difficult to put your finger on precisely what that is. For example, at the start of the season, George Williams was playing great. All those 8 wins were not largely, but he played a great role in them. But then he had a spell out of the side with injury, and he's come back, and he's yet to start firing again. Hopefully he will do before much longer, because they need him to, and if they're going to mount a challenge for the title, they've got to start winning soon.
Mm-hmm. I think with the Wolves, we saw a lot in their first 20 minutes. I thought they really showed a lot of energy, played some expansive attacking football, and it seemed around that 20-minute mark where we saw a few errors start to stack up. I think Matt Duffy dropped the ball trying to get his foot back in goal. He also sort of made an error down the other end of the field, which saw Ikavalu run 80 metres and score. And I think they sort of seemed in the game up until that point, but it just seemed as though they dropped their heads after those errors.
There was a time early in the second half, probably the first 5 or 10 minutes in the second half, where I thought they seemed fired up. I think there was a refereeing decision that didn't go their way, and it seemed to fire them up. Mm-hmm. And for a time, they looked as though they could come back into the game, but then it fell away as the Dragons scored again, and the head seemed to go down a little, I thought, and somebody needs to get hold of them. I mean, the good thing about obviously Sam Burgess coming is that Sam is, I mean, he won't be here till next year, of course, so we can't do anything about this year, but he's the sort of guy who never gave in on the field. He is a born leader, and I couldn't imagine a side of his giving up easily at any stage of a game, really. So hopefully that is one thing that he will bring to the side next year.
Absolutely. And that moment you touched on, I think it was the Joe Philbin. He was held down the tackle, fighting to get up and play the ball, and they pinged him for an incorrect play the ball.
That's right, yeah.
And
it could have gone the other way, couldn't it?
That's right. And as you said, like the defensive line speed after that error, I thought it was great to see. They showed a lot of heart, but
they did.
Unfortunately couldn't sustain that for the rest of the match. But yeah, so I guess Catlins Dragons, Warrington will wrap it up there. Now, going to the second televised game, we saw Leigh 13 defeat Leeds 6. What were your thoughts on this game?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I saw the Leigh team, I wondered whether, Adrian Lamb had made a mistake by picking almost his strongest team. I mean, Zach Hardacre wasn't in, and Josh Charnley. But apart from that, it was mainly the strongest team that he could have picked. And as I've written in the paper this week, fortune favours the brave. He didn't have any injuries from that game, so they'll go into the Challenge Cup final on the back of great momentum and a fine performance to beat Leeds. But Leeds, gosh, just imagine Blake Austin being taken out from, under your feet, so to speak, and going to Castleford with the coach not really knowing anything about it. And you could see they were missing him. Blake Austin's been probably their main attacking weapon over the last few weeks at Leeds. So to be suddenly without him, they put Corey Johnston, young kid, in his place. Now, Corey didn't do anything disastrously wrong, but he obviously hasn't got the attacking quality that Blake has. And they had young Jack Sinfield on the bench, and he didn't come on till 70 minutes when they were lacking any penetration. Whether he could have given them some is obviously debatable, but so it didn't look good for Leeds, and they now are just on 18 points, 4 points outside the top 6 with 6 games to go. It looks a very hard ask for them to get into the top 6 now. Particularly, I thought, with the loss of Richie Myler at full back, because they've lost Blake Austin, but it looks as though Richie Myler's out for the rest of the season as well. And I think Richie Myler, one of the most underrated players in Super League, the way he links in from full back, they really missed that, I thought. And they had young Luke Hooley at full back, but obviously he's not a Richie Myler, hasn't got the experience and know-how that Richie has. And I thought they missed Richie Myler as much as they missed Blake Austin.
Absolutely. In the way the fullbacks play is, almost a third or fourth receiver if you include the lock. But
absolutely.
And that I noticed with Leigh, I think it might have been just before half-time, John Asiata, he seemed to have sustained that wrist complaint. And I think they might have just brought him off as a precaution ahead of this weekend's clash. But you could see that Leeds early, they were really taking the fight to Leigh and kicking to the corners and trying to, force the area with their line speed. The thing I liked most, I think, about Leigh's attack going forward is it seemed as though at half-time Adrian Lambs thought, well, we're going to sit Asiata for the rest of this. We're going to strip back the game plan. And it seemed as though they went back to trying to win the game through the middle, kicking to the corners and then trying to force the error. And we saw their great hustle and scrambling defence on their own line. And I think that's what sort of separates the contenders from the pretenders. You've got to be able to rely on your defence.
Absolutely, yeah. And Leeds couldn't hold out Tom Amone when he went over for that second try. And I really like Tom Amone at Leigh. I think he's played a major part in their form this year, and I think he's going to be a big danger to Hull Kingston Rovers at Wembley on Saturday. And yet, it's a game of inches, isn't it? Because of course, young Jared O'Connor scored one try from dummy half, and then looked as though he'd scored another. The referee gave the try but went to the video referee, and the video referee just noticed the slightest of slight knock-ons when he touched down in the second half, and that would have probably brought the game level again if the try had been allowed. So, it is a game of inches, and just the slightest mistake, can just kibosh a try, can't it? And it did in that case. And they must have been really disappointed, and certainly I thought the fans sounded as though they were very disappointed at Headingley on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on, we also had, I guess we'll go to the Saints defeated Salford 18-15, quite a tightly contested battle.
Yeah, and there was a bit of controversy in that because one of the Saints' tries came a couple of tackles after there looked to be a clear case of the Saints wingers T. Ritson having putting a foot on the touchline before passing the ball, but not being called by the touch judge. And after the game, Paul Rowley, the Salford coach, was absolutely livid about that and made some very strong comments, incredibly disappointed to lose that game. They'd been winning 15-2 at one stage, and Saints came back to win with 3 tries to win 18-15 with Jack Welsby scoring the winner. And it is the case, isn't it? Close games can often be not decided, but the result can be clearly influenced by a wrong decision by a match official. And I think there's no doubt about it that touch judge should have called touch for T. Ritson being in touch, and Salford would have then had the ball and would have probably, gone downfield with it. Not necessarily to score, but, they could have maintained their advantage. So, and it's disappointing for Rowley, because I think they've lost several games in a row now at Salford. They've dropped out of the top 6. They've still got the ability to get back into it, and, compared to Warrington or even Hull KR, they've certainly got a chance, but it's more difficult for them now.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on, Wigan 64 defeated Hull KR 6. This wasn't
Hull KR did the opposite of what Leigh did and played a very weakened team. They gave debuts to 3 academy players and took 3 other players on loan just for that game from other clubs. So they were never going to win it, and it's debatable whether they should have done that. I must admit, I don't like the Challenge Cup final being in mid-season, precisely because of that tendency, which will happen for clubs who are in the cup final to play a severely weakened side in the week leading up to it. Let's imagine that Hull KR had been playing Castleford or Wakefield, for example, and had more or less given them the points in a very tight relegation battle. I think that would have been really, there'd have been a lot of squeals of anger from, one set of supporters if that had happened. And I think it really should be looked at very carefully, the position of the Challenge Cup final in the season. Talk about that again if you want a bit later.
Yeah, we'll get into that later. But yeah, as you said, huge ramifications if that were the case. And it seemed like just a bit of a training run for Wigan, who are clicking really nicely. You see Bevan French and Jay Field, they seem to have worked out.
They usually do at this time of the year.
Yeah, they could be a bit of a dark horse, I guess, heading into the
yeah, well, I'd say they're more than a dark horse. They're probably, if anything, they're the favourites to win the competition, I think.
Alrighty. Now, moving on, I guess we'll look at the Huddersfield Giants, 28 defeated the Castleford Tigers 0 on Friday night, I believe that match was.
Well, that was a game. That was the game when there was a fans' protest. A number of fans were refusing to leave the ground. But has there ever been a protest or demonstration anywhere in the world that got a result so quickly. Because they were demanding that Andy Last be sacked, and he was just a few minutes later, and they'd achieved their objective. And 28-0 was, my goodness, it's such a comprehensive defeat, isn't it? And it just did look disastrous, really, for Castleford. And I wasn't in the slightest bit surprised that Andy got the push. And I'm very sorry, though, really, because he's a great guy, Andy Last, lovely bloke to talk to, and I always enjoy speaking to him. And he's a very, he's got a lot of rugby league knowledge. He's technically he's very got a very good grasp of the game. But the trouble is, I think the problem with Andy, if you think about coaching, Jake, there are two elements to it, aren't there? One is everything technical, understanding the tactics and strategy of the game. But the second thing is motivation. And some coaches are great motivators, but not so hot on tactics. And some coaches are great on tactics, but struggle to motivate players to give of their best. And I think Andy was probably a bit lacking in the latter, but maybe not in the former. Who knows? But it's obviously his reign is now over, and we've got to wait and see who they will appoint. They've not rushed into it, at least as yet, but a few names are being mentioned. John Keir, who was a ex-Castleford player, of course, went from many years ago, his playing days. And John is a great motivator. John Keir's great strength is his ability to stand in a dressing room, address a bunch of players and make them want to run through a brick wall. John can do that. And he did it for Wakefield in 2006 when he was appointed for the last 6 games of the season, when Wakefield looked to be in all sorts of relegation trouble. And he managed to motivate them to win, I think it was 4 out of the last 6. And on the last day of the season, they played Castleford at home in a relegation battle and beat them. And Jason Dimitri was playing for Wakefield, by the way, then the captain of Wakefield at the time, who's now the South Sydney coach. So, John's got a track record for coming in with 6 games to go and getting a team out of trouble. And, of course, Castleford have got exactly 6 games to go. Yep. So
history may repeat itself.
You never know. Yeah, Wakefield will be hoping it doesn't, of course.
Yeah, exactly right. But moving on to Wakefield, they've went down 42 points to 4 against Hull FC. Unfortunately, not the Wakefield we saw from a week prior.
No, they don't seem able to produce their home form when they travel away. I thought they might give Hull a sterner challenge. But the great thing for Hull, if you look at the highlights of that game, obviously not seen the whole game, but I have seen the highlights, and I think the important thing for them is, they're just gelling as a side quite effectively now. They look, unsure of themselves earlier in the season, but They really look. I really like some of their players. Adam Swift, the winger, I've always had a great regard for him. Once they start building up confidence in a game, they're the sort of team that can run away with a game. And I think they clearly did that against Wakefield. Yeah.
And Jake Clifford had his hands on everything. He's going to be a huge loss come season.
He will, but I think the fact that he's leaving. I mean, it's obviously disappointing for Hull that he's leaving, but I think the fact that he is doing might really just be a great motivation for him to get Hull into the playoffs. They're only 2 points outside the playoffs now. They're level with Salford on 20 points. Hull KR and Warrington are on 22. There's every chance, I think, that Hull will get into the playoffs, given the way they're playing at the moment. And from then, anything's possible, isn't it?
Absolutely. Right, well, I think that's the games all wrapped up. I don't think I've missed any there. But as we touched on at the start of the episode, a lot of news to get into this week. We'll start with the Sam Burgess news that he will take on the head coaching role for the Wolves from next year.
Isn't that interesting? Warrington do love taking risks, don't they? And I think you would have to say that this is a risk. Sam's never coached at first grade level. He's obviously an assistant coach with South Sydney under Jason Demetriou, and he obviously thinks that he's ready for a major job. And, Sam has some incredible qualities, or did have some incredible qualities as a player. He's a fantastic leader, brilliant player, an extraordinarily tough, single-minded guy who certainly doesn't know the meaning of the word, give in or surrender. He's never surrendered in his life to anything. But the question is, can he still do it? I mean, and he does bring some baggage with him, of course, from some fairly high-profile front-page news stories that we all know about that have been in the Australian press. But does he have the intellectual equipment to become a first-grade coach and put a pre-season together and think, about recruitment and so on? I mean, obviously, everybody, including me, we all hope that he can do that, because to have a successful Warrington with Sam Burgess at the helm would be fantastic for Super League. He's such a magnetic personality, but it is a big ask. And Warrington, I mean, what surprised me, Jake, was that Warrington made the decision so quickly when they had potentially a lot of other people. I mean, obviously they were turned down by their number one target, but then moved very quickly to Justin Holbrook. That was, of course. They then moved very quickly to appoint and announce Sam Burgess, and obviously we've got to assume that they did their due diligence on Sam and spoke to the right people about his capabilities and so on. So let's hope it works. But they have had a habit in the past of signing players, that look to be sort of PR events, really, rather than, like Greg Inglis. 2 or 3 years ago they signed him and made a big fuss of that, but Greg only played 2 or 3 games for them, and they signed the rugby union player Luther Burrell, and that really wasn't, came with a big fanfare, but wasn't really successful. So I hope that their judgment is a lot better now. And of course, last week we heard their chairman Simon Middleton saying, "Oh well, it was a mistake to have appointed Darryl Powell." I'd love to know what Darryl Powell's response to that would be. And it's a funny thing to say, isn't it? Even though you might think, well, the results make it look as though it's probably correct, but you wonder what the heck was going on at Warrington while Darryl was the coach there, and only they will know, of course. But it's a interesting club, and it's a club that ought to be winning a lot more than it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And those comments come at a strange time, considering they did start so well to the season.
Absolutely.
But one thing I will say about Sam Burgess is it's a huge risk for him to take, I think, in his professional career.
It is.
I look back to the NRL coaches that have gone from assistants to head coaching roles in the last 12 to 24 months, and you've got names like Craig Fitzgibbon, who served a lengthy apprenticeship under Trent Robinson at the Roosters. Even this year, you look at Cameron Ciraldo and Andrew Webster, the Bulldogs and Warriors head coaches.
Absolutely.
They both served pretty lengthy assistant roles at the Panthers. You look at Jason Riles now, who has been an assistant at the Storm, the Roosters, and I think he'll be the one to take over from Craig Bellamy at the Storm when
Very
he eventually
possibly,
calls it quits. So, these are all highly touted up and coming and current coaches that have served long and lengthy apprenticeships under successful coaches. I just worry for Sam, has he had enough time under Jason Demetrio to be effective?
The $64,000 question, isn't it? And we can only find that out next season, I suppose. But it will be interesting finding out, won't it?
Yeah.
It will certainly add. I'm already looking forward to the pre-season launch next year when all the clubs come together and at a central location. and all the coaches lined up for the media to speak to, we already know who will have the biggest queue of media people wanting to speak to him. It's bound to be Sam.
Yep.
So we'll just see how that goes.
Yeah. I think for a player or a coach now like Sam, he's done it all. He's came over to Australia, won a premiership. He's represented his country for Union and League. It'd be great if he could have a Billy Slater sort of effect on his squad the same way Billy has on the Maroons.
And Billy was a risky appointment as well. Right. Nobody quite knew how Billy Slater would work out, did they, for the Maroons? No coaching experience. And, has done a wonderful job for the Maroons. So, obviously that's a rep team and not a club team. So Billy doesn't have the day-to-day work that being at a club entails. But hopefully that's a good precedent for Sam, even so.
Absolutely. I think the one thing that will be working in his favour as well is, and we saw it with Billy Slater at the Origin level, is he's going to have players in his squad that looked up to him and idolised him in his playing days.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that'll galvanise the squad next year, and they'll take everything he says as gospel and buy into what he's trying to implement there. But yeah, very exciting times.
Well, I read a comment from Cameron Murray at South Sydney who said, the thing about Sam is that is you know that he's such a legend that you don't want him to think any less of you by playing badly. You want him to respect you, and in doing that, you'll play out of your skin in order to impress him, and hopefully that will apply next year as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I guess we sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, Andy Last being sacked. Is there any other potential coaching names you've heard thrown up that could take over from next year?
At Castleford, you mean?
Yeah, Castleford, my bad.
Next year? Well, one obvious name is Darryl Powell, who came from Castleford and went to Warrington, and I suppose he might say now that was not necessarily the best decision he ever made. Who knows? And he enjoyed incredible success with Castleford. And I think I mentioned it last week, didn't I? That, his 2017 Castleford team played the best rugby that I've seen in Super League. And if they could get back to that, it would be worth appointing him to get back to it. But it's a bit of a poison chalice at the moment, is Castleford, because they've got a squad that is aging, and it's interesting to look at some of their players who they've signed in the last couple of seasons, and they've several of them they've let go. I mean, Albert Vetti, they signed him from Hull KR during the close season, and he's now on loan at Doncaster. Big prop forward who showed at Hull KR that near the line he's incredibly dangerous, and yet they don't seem able to have used that facet of his game at Castleford. They let Mahe Fanua go and Beretta Ferramo, and they were only signed in 2022. So there's a big rebuilding job necessary at Castleford. I know they've signed some players already for next season, but it's not an easy club to go to, I don't think, because they're not financially very strong. I don't know quite how much of the salary cap they spend, if they spend the whole or if they only spend a percentage of it. But you're always going to be up against it as a coach at Castleford. So I'm not sure who else would be in the frame, really, if I'm really honest about it. But who knows? There are potentially. You've got the guys like Richard Agar. Would he come from New Zealand Warriors to coach Castleford, and would he be a popular appointee? I'm not quite so sure. Brian McDermott, who's assistant coach at Newcastle Knights, he might be a good fit at Castleford, I would have thought. But would he come back from Australia to do that job? Difficult to know, isn't it?
How much does their impending Super League status have on them searching for a coach? Obviously, if they get relegated.
Well, if I were a coach, being approached to coach any team, I don't think I'd sign on the dotted line until I knew they were safe in Super League. And so it makes everything difficult. When you're in danger of relegation, it makes the recruitment of anybody difficult, whether it's coaches or players. And I would think that it would be difficult for them now. And of course, the priority for them is just winning that Wakefield game next time out, and then winning enough games to avoid the chop. And I'm not even sure, if I were in their shoes, I'm not sure that I'd be looking for a long-term coach at the moment, just for somebody who can get them out of trouble in this last 6 games.
If you're a betting man, you had to put your money on which club will get relegated going into next season, who would you?
Well, the complicating factor is that Castleford have now got Blake Austin, and he will play presumably in all of those last 6 games for them. And that might just swing it in their favour. If you look at the table, they're level on points, and Castleford's points difference is 22 points better than Wakefield's. That could be crucial at the end of the year, couldn't it? If they finish on the same number of points, points difference could come into it, or would come into it. Mm-hmm. So, crikey, I wouldn't really like to say, but I think if I really had to put my life on it, I would say that recruiting Blake Austin could be the thing that keeps Castleford in Super League. And I think if I were a betting man, I'd say that Castleford were probably something like 6-5 on to stay there, and Wakefield was 6-5 against at the moment.
Yeah. And, they would have loved to have had Blake Austin over the weekend.
They certainly would.
Yeah, but before we move on to previewing the Challenge Cup final, is there any other news stories circulating at the moment that you'd like to get into?
Well, just on the international front, I see that Troy Grant has said he's going to step down from the from his role as chairman of the International Rugby League. Now that they've made a calendar and sorted out the next World Cup, and it's unfortunate, I think, that because Troy is a pretty significant figure in Australian politics. Apart from anything else, he was the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, and the thing about people like that is that they know which doors to knock on and which doors to open, don't they? So, I think that that will be a blow to International Rugby League. I don't know who will take over from him. Of course, they've got Peter Vlandis and Andrew Abdo on the International Rugby League board now. So hopefully Troy's departure won't be too bad for the game. But we'll just have to see how it goes, because we still don't know where those 2026 World Cup games will be held. Do we? Don't know who's hosting it, and we don't know, therefore, where the games are going to be. So, I think that's that needs sorting out as soon as possible.
Definitely. Now, looking forward to the Challenge Cup final this weekend. You mentioned in your article this week, it's one of the ones you've been excited, or it's the most excited you've been for a Challenge Cup final in a long time. Yeah. I guess, what are you expecting from this weekend? Are we hoping for a packed crowd?
Well, yes, I would like to think so. Projections at the moment say 60,000, which it's a 90,000 capacity stadium, so I would hope that they'd get more than that. But I just wish that we saw more promotion of the game, really, because maybe I'm just missing it, because obviously you don't see every promotion that the RFL runs, but I just wish it had a higher profile. I've just got an email today from a reader who says he's bought but gets the Metro newspaper, and there's no mention of it in there, and so on. There is a bit of a promotion on the BBC, but it's a very crowded marketplace, isn't it, with sport, and it's unfortunate, really, from our point of view, that the Challenge Cup final is on the same weekend as Premier League football starts. It doesn't look to me like a great time to hold the final, as I've said a bit earlier. There are several reasons why this weekend might not necessarily be the best weekend to start to hold the final. But it's here, and we've got to handle it. So, but I just hope that there's a late campaign to, get more people there. I do hear, having said that the hospitality is going well, and for example, the Bobby Moore suite, which is a very popular hospitality suite at the stadium, is crammed full. You can't get in there now, and hopefully there are a few more elements of the corporate world that are taking up positions, at Wembley on Saturday, and it would be great if that is the case. But we just I'd just love to see a full house, and though that upper tier not being empty. That's what I'd really like to see.
And if you could, have your say on the scheduling of the Challenge Cup, what would your suggestion be to the organisers on when they should hold that event?
Oh well, I'd go back to how it used to be many years ago. Many years ago, they used to have the Challenge Cup and final and the Championship final on successive weekends. And I would put the Challenge Cup final on the weekend prior to the grand final to have an absolutely massive climax to the season. I think the grand final, coming a week after the semi-finals, is foolish. It needs a 2-week gap. We saw in a couple of years ago when Catalans got to the grand final that with only a week's gap between the two games, the semi-final and the final, the Catalans fans couldn't buy tickets and organise travel within just a few days. So the attendance was well down. If they'd had a 2-week gap, it would have been a lot easier for them to get to the game. And if you had a 2-week gap but filled it in the middle with the Challenge Cup, it would make everything so much easier in my view, and it would be a thrilling climax to the season because you might well have 4 different teams contesting both games, or you might have one team in both games, trying to do the double, and I think that would be so dramatic. And it always used to be, in when I was a lot younger growing up, we used to have what was called the top 4 playoff to decide the champions in a 30-team league. We had the top 4 teams playing off, 1v4, 2v3, and then the winners in the final. And that usually came the week after the Challenge Cup final. And I remember some great events, in the old days when, Wakefield won the Challenge Cup in 1960, and the following week played Wigan in the Championship final at Bradford and had 82,000 people watching that game. Sadly, that Wakefield didn't win it though. In 1962, Wakefield won the cup and again played Huddersfield in the Championship final the week after, and at Odsal. And those games placed together generated massive interest, and we're missing that now. The Challenge Cup has lost a certain aura about it because it actually isn't right at the end of the season. And I think that's the time to play it, personally. But I doubt whether we'll see that happening, unfortunately. But, that would be great as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be interesting, if there was one side to get into both of the finals, how that would go in terms of rest and recovery between the two. But
it was a massive challenge, yeah. And occasionally teams used to do the double, but it was an enormous challenge for them. But that's, challenges are there to be overcome, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's you climb one mountain and then you've got the next one, and you don't give up on it.
That's it, and it can be beneficial to some teams. I guess they, if they were to win the Challenge Cup final, they can ride that momentum and success into the next weekend. So
absolutely,
hopefully, they look at and review it going forward. And,
if I run rugby league, it would be organised differently. Believe me.
I think we all sort of feel that way.
Yeah.
Now, looking forward to the two sides. What do you think the key matchup's going to be between the Leopards and Hull KR this weekend?
Well, I think I really think that the crucial battle. I mean, both teams have got great ability in the backs. Obviously, Lachlan Lamb has been outstanding at halfback for Leigh this year, and unfortunately for Hull KR, Jordan Abdul won't have recovered from injury in time. I'm pretty certain about that, of course. But they've got Brad Schneider, who's clearly a very capable guy, not least in kicking winning field goals, as we've seen, recently. But I think the match will be won up front because, the Leigh pack is really formidable. We mentioned Tom Amone a bit earlier, but he isn't the only one. Obviously, John Asiata, who I assume will play despite having a bit of a wrist problem, I think you said in the Leeds game. He's outstanding. Rob Mulhern has been playing really well for Leigh at prop as well. So I think, and of course you've got Edwin Ipapi, who is so dangerous, from dummy half near the opposition line. So Hull KR, to my mind, have got to find a way of making sure that they can hold the Leigh pack, and particularly the Leigh middles, and that's going to be quite a challenge for them. And if they can do it, I think they will then have the ability in their back division to score some points. And I think that they're going to be helped by that, because I think, there's been a lot of conjecture about whether Ryan Hall will play on the wing for them, having been out of action with a calf injury. And it looks now as though he's going to recover from that and play. And I think that's quite important, because he is such a big game player. And in big games, it's a good thing to have big game players, isn't it? I really do think that some players seem to play at their best when it's a really big game, and we'll see whether that's the case. But and if he does play, the fascinating thing is that it'll be opposite Tom Briscoe for Leigh who'll play on the right wing. And when Leeds beat Hull Kingston Rovers 50 points to 0 in 2015 at Wembley, Tom Briscoe scored 5 tries and won the Landstod Trophy. So, a battle between Tom Briscoe and Ryan Hall will be really interesting, I think. And of course, looking at again from Leigh's point of view, Zach Hardacre didn't play against Leeds on Sunday. I assume he will come back into the side. And it'll be interesting to see where he plays, because they had Gareth O'Brien playing at fullback. I really like Gareth O'Brien, and of course, if we've talked about Brad Schneider being the field goal king, well, Gareth O'Brien is equally good on the Leigh side if he's on the field, if he gets in the team. We all remember, or you probably don't, but in 2016 in the £1 million game, he scored that incredible field goal for Salford at Hull Kingston Rovers that kept them in Super League. So it's a really fascinating thing. I think Adrian Lamb has got some interesting selection dilemmas this week. Good dilemmas, he's got a full squad, or more or less full squad, and he's got to pick 17 who'll do the job for him. And I think there are one or two players for Leigh who will obviously be disappointed at the end of the day. And the same is true for Hull Kingston Rovers, of course. But, but I suppose what I'm really saying, though, Jake, is that I don't know who's going to win. And that's great, isn't it?
That's right.
And
it's been.
I like not knowing who's going to win.
Yeah, that's right. You don't want it to become too predictable.
No.
We've touched on it before, but how long it's been since either of these sides have won a Challenge Cup. What do you think it'll mean to either of these sides if they do win this weekend?
I think it'll mean everything, really, to everybody in the two clubs. I mean, Hull Kingston Rovers, first of all, they were humiliated in 2015. It was the biggest margin of defeat that any club has ever suffered in the Challenge Cup final. They obviously got something badly wrong that day. They were up against a Leeds team, though, that was right on top of its game at the height of its powers. So, that defeat wasn't entirely unexpected, but the magnitude of it certainly was. And they were coached at the time by Chris Chester, who's now director of rugby at Leigh. So the good thing for Leigh is that I think Chris has sort of admitted that they got a few things wrong 8 years ago, and they won't make the same mistake now that he's with Leigh. Hull Kingston Rovers are still smarting from that defeat, and they will be absolutely. I know, their chairman or owner, should I say, Neil Hudgell, was desperately upset by what happened that year, and they're incredibly determined not to let it happen again. So I think it's going to, it's just going to be a great game. I hope that both sides throw the ball about a bit, but I just think that, Leigh might try to exert dominance up front. They might go for an early lead and then protect it, and I'd make that. I think they're the narrow favourites with the bookies, and I think they'll probably win. But I would, don't hold me to it.
Yeah, great. And what can you tell me about the other matchups on the weekend? Obviously, we've got a tightly contested women's final as well.
Absolutely, yes. St Helens and Leeds are real strong rivals in the women's game, and they have been now for a few years. I think St Helens are really determined to win this game, though. I think St Helens, they beat York in the semi-final, and I think they will just be a bit too strong for Leeds. But it'll be a game really worth seeing. I'm really delighted that it's on BBC Two on Saturday, kicking off at 12 o'clock, of course. And I hope it gets a really good audience, because women's sport, we're seeing it in Australia at the moment, aren't we, with the FIFA World Cup, how women's sport is really coming along so strongly. And we're seeing, of course, the NRLW with some great performances in that, and some really respectable crowds turning out for Women's Rugby League down under, now that it's become professionalised. And, several women playing over there, of course, from England. Yep. So, it's fantastic to see. And but I think coming back to this, Jodie Cunningham is an iconic women's player for St Helens, and she's into her 30s now. I don't know how much longer Jodie will continue playing, but I know that they will be so single-minded about winning this game, and I think St Helens will be taking quite a few supporters down to watch them play, and I think it could be their day. But Leeds again. Don't be too surprised if I'm dead wrong.
Yeah, great. Any bold predictions for the weekend going forward that you'd like to make?
Well, the other interesting thing, we've talked about the women's game. There's also the 1895 Cup, which will be played after the Challenge Cup final. It's a shame in a way that it's played after the Challenge Cup final. It would be great, really, if the Challenge Cup could be the final game, which ideally it would be. But of course, it's Batley's first ever visit to Wembley. And the interesting thing is, Batley won the Challenge Cup the first year it was played in 1897. And I think they won it another couple of times soon after that. But they've never been to Wembley. The Challenge Cup final moved to Wembley in 1929. And Batley have just never featured there. So that's going to be an incredible thing for them. Halifax have traditionally been a bigger club than Batley, and they last won it in 1987 when they beat St Helens 1918. Two very strong Yorkshire rivals. They're very situated very near to each other, of course, and I think they'll both take probably a couple of thousand fans down each to watch them on Saturday. You would think that, if we look at the tables, Batley are just slightly ahead of Halifax in the championship, so that might make them the favourites. Craig Lingard, of course, is their coach, and he'll be leaving them at the end of the season to go permanently to Castleford. And Castleford, if Castleford drop into the championship, I think they'll make him the full-time coach in the championship there. But it would be a great way for Craig Lingard to bow out at Batley with a cup-winning performance at Wembley, and I think they might just do it.
Yeah, great, fantastic. I can't wait for it. I'm sure you can't either. But yeah, looking forward to getting down there. Hopefully, we can have heaps of fans turn out.
We hope so. Yeah, and we can all have a great day and enjoy some great rugby. And don't forget, the one thing you've not mentioned so far, Jake, you might not even know it's on, is the Champions Schools Cup final, which
it's in the morning, isn't it?
It's at 10:10 in the morning.
Okay.
And I don't think I don't know what time the gates open, but they will be playing obviously to a very small crowd of people. And oddly enough, the two schools who are playing in it, and it's a national knockout tournament, the two schools that are playing in it come from Leigh and East Hull. Oh, wow. You know, it's Archbishop Centimore College, I think, school from Hull, and Bedford High School from Leigh. So hopefully quite a few Leigh fans might get down early and cheer on Bedford High. And that game is played for a trophy called the Stephen Mullaney Trophy. And again, that's a really, symbolic thing, because Stephen Mullaney, for those who don't know, any listeners who don't know, Stephen was a young player who played in the Schools Curtain Raiser in 1986 and scored a really memorable try playing for Wakefield Schools, and ran down he touched down and then ran back down the pitch, absolutely crying his eyes out. And then very sadly was killed a few months later in a road accident, crossing the road, and the most tragic possible circumstances. And it was devastating for his parents, obviously. And the trophy for the champion schools has been named after him ever since, and his parents will present it, which is marvellous, I think. And it's an incredibly symbolic moment, I think, when that happens.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always nice when you see such a significant game like this played in someone's memory.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Wow, that's really heartwarming. Well, I guess we can wrap it up here. Hopefully, we get some beautiful weather on Saturday, and the football gods are kind to us.
And hopefully a few people might listen to us on the way down to Wembley.
Yes,
you never know.
You've got a few hours to kill. Check on our first and our second episode now. And if you've got this far into the podcast, thanks for listening.
And just remind us where people can listen to it, because it's probably a good thing to do that.
Can listen to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts now. I think we're trying to get it on Google Podcasts. Alternatively, you can watch it on YouTube. We do film. If you've got some time to kill, feel free to put us, on in your headphones or in the car on the way down to Wembley this weekend. I'm sure we'll have all the news to wrap up next week as well. So, exciting times.
Great stuff, Jake, and thanks very much for doing this. It's a real pleasure to be with you on this podcast.
No worries. Thank you, Martyn.